Hello, I think it's recording. Yeah, it is recording because there's a little thingy in the corner.
Okay. Do you want me to get closer or farther
You're
away
fine.
or?
You're fine. Okay, so first question. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Yes. I'm currently an associate professor at UCLA in the Department of Information Studies. I was born of Chinese background in Chiclayo, Peru, and at the age of 10 moved to Vancouver, Canada. And so I grew up there. I did some elementary school. I graduated with my high school degree, went on to do my bachelor's there, and eventually I did 1 year of studies of a master's at Monterey Institute of International Studies, and then I pursued a master's in library and information science, which then led me to do a PhD, and I ended up working here at UCLA.
Okay, so you mentioned that you got a master's. So another question is, can I ask you what inspired you to study multicultural education or kind of like ethnic studies, like specifically Chinese or from Latin America?
Well, I had always been interested in socially in people, and I had never really seen a possibility to really do this kind of work. So I had never really thought of it from a young age. What came to light for me was when I was here in the United States studying for that 1 year, pursuing a master's in translation interpretation. I was able to learn about Chinese Canadian history in the United States, and I thought, oh, that's a bit strange. Why am I learning about this when I never learned anything about my own Chinese, Canadian background when I was in Canada? And so I started to realize that, oh, there isn't much history being documented as well as being shared in the educational K-12 system. And even, in Canada, less at the university level. So I always kept that in mind. I did a research project on the Chinese in Canada and a little bit on the Chinese in the U.S. And so I kind of left it at that, but it was just something for me, eye-opening. And so from there, I, continued my studies, and I was always interested in doing something with the Chinese community. So when I was in London, Ontario, there was a smaller population, so there was an opportunity for me to connect with the Chinese Canadian community there. And I started to get involved with the Chinese Canadian National Council. And through that council, we had an opportunity to do a lot in terms of educating the community at large about Chinese Canadian history and Chinese culture, and also interacting with the Chinese community. So I was able to learn more about Chinese culture for myself because at home it wasn't something that was really taught. It was just something that we lived. We celebrated a lot of Chinese traditions, ate Chinese food, but I didn't know the background of a lot of, what does it mean to be Chinese or the history. And so it was a really enriching experience for me to be able to work with the Chinese Canadian community in London and to become familiar with some of the Chinese Canadian history. And then during the process of doing my PhD, my dissertation advisor learned that I was doing all this work with the ethnic community, especially the Chinese, and was wondering why I hadn't thought of doing this as a topic for my dissertation. And to me, it was like, oh, I didn't realize it was important enough to pursue. And so this was the first indication that yes, this is something that I could pursue, but I decided not to focus my PhD on it. I decided to do my PhD on the topic that I had already selected, which was on the information seeking behavior of literary critics. So I finished up with that topic, but I was able to gain the research skills to then use it for other areas on which I'm very passionate about. So, which is multicultural education and information for multicultural groups, and then specifically also on the Chinese in Latin America. And one of the reasons I was interested goes back to what I had said earlier, which is I hadn't seen much of this being taught at universities and less of it in terms of growing up at all. So for me, it was important trying to ensure that the voice of people with my experience, whether it's the Chinese in Canada or the Chinese in Latin America, was covered somewhere, recorded, documented, etc. So I'm really inspired by, there's a historian, a Cuban historian called Juan Pérez de la Riva, and he wrote Historia de la gente sin historia. That means history of people without history. And so he's responsible for writing the history of people of African descent and Chinese descent in Cuba. And so if you want to learn about that history, he's a key figure. And so that really inspired me. And also the other reasons that kind of allowed me to pursue this area was that I also wanted to give it an insider perspective. There was some research that has been done, but that research is always from an outsider perspective, somebody who doesn't come from that community. And so that research is wonderful work in terms of they have relied on archival documents as well as some exposure to the community. But I know that the Chinese community is not always one that's very easy to participate in, to enter, and for the Chinese community to trust an outsider. So I thought with me being an insider and outsider at the same time, right? Being of Chinese background, but not necessarily being of the communities that I study, then there would be the objectivity as well as the ability to gain an insider perspective. And then one catalyst in terms of getting me to work on the Chinese in Latin America was it's a challenge for me to do some of this work because I'm in information studies and not in anthropology or in sociology. So the one catalyst that kind of got me going was the first conference on it's called ISCO Conference, International Society for the Studies of Chinese Overseas. So this conference took place in 1992 in Berkeley, and because of that particular conference that was headed by Lin Chi Wang, then that gave me the opportunity to write my first paper on the Chinese in Latin America, or specifically on the Chinese in Peru.
Okay. Well, can you please tell me more about your publication from the real world to the web-based ethnic studies community challenges and experience of the Chinese in Latin America?
And well, the recent developments in technology have shown that people are using the internet more to communicate, right? So ICTs, or information communication technologies, to be able to interact with each other, to have more of a presence on the internet. So since it has been shown that many communities are doing that, I wanted to see if indeed it was the case for the Chinese in Latin America, because it's not just any communities, but a lot of ethnic communities worldwide are doing this, and especially if you are communities that are dispersed, then there is the opportunity to interconnect with each other. And so I thought, okay, let me look at the Chinese in Latin America. I wanted to use Benedict Anderson's notion of imagined community, because I already knew that, for example, in Peru, there was a sense of community because in Lima there's a Chinatown, there are Chinese associations that are interconnected. There's the Chinese Benevolent Association, and it has chapters across Peru. There are various Chinese newspapers, there is a magazine called Oriental. So there was already a network of media and other community organizations. And so I wanted to see if this network of community, which allows us to create an imagined community of Chinese Peruvians, that this would indeed happen if we look at the internet. So when I looked at the internet, I was able to find that there was a web presence, but not what would be a real web-based community. So there were web pages for Chinese Peruvian restaurants and other commercial enterprises, as well as websites for Chinese organizations. And there was also, I'm aware of, also web presence for some of the Chinese schools in Peru. And I'm also aware that individuals with Chinese background would communicate with each other in Peru, as well as with their relatives and friends who are overseas. For example, I was born in Peru, and now I live in the United States, and I've been in contact with my godfather who lives, and my cousin, both of them who live in Lima. So I So there is that kind of communication. But